Welcome. Lovely to see everybody again this morning, and good to have you back in this series on looking at the Sermon on the Mount. As I said, the last couple of weeks we've done this in a very strange way. We kind of looked at the Beatitudes at the beginning of lockdown. Before then, we'd looked at on various occasions at Matthew 6, and so now we've now arrived back at Matthew 7. So I'll just lower that so I can see Angela. Make sure she's behaving. Sorry, to move. I couldn't see you, Angela, with the microphone in the way. So we're back to Matthew 7. We're on a short passage. I told you something last week, which is I'm now adjusting yet again. Last week we looked at verses 7 to 11 and the call of Jesus to ask, seek, and knock. And I said last week we would be looking at verse 12 this week. And so I'm going to say to you this week, we're going to be looking at verse 12 next week. So we will get there next week, but I'm going to hold that over for that service. And this week we're going to be focusing simply on these two verses, tiny little bit, Matthew 7 verses 13 and 14. And you know when a newsreader is about to deliver the news, and before it goes to that particular item, they say that they want to warn viewers that there may be some distressing images that you're about to see in this next piece. And these two verses, I think, are verses that need that kind of pre-warning. We are going to encounter things this morning that Jesus says and taught his disciples and taught the crowds that some of us will really not want to hear. And I think it's important that we go into this being aware of that. But I want to sort of qualify that by saying that the fact that Jesus believed that these things needed to be said means that they are things that we do need to hear. So we're into that sort of territory this morning just for these two verses. We're going to begin just by noticing some very obvious things about what Jesus says. So do have a look down at verse 13 and verse 14 of Matthew 7 as we go. And to start by stating the very obvious and summarising it, Jesus makes clear here in these two verses that there are two roads, just two roads, that people walk on and travel on in this life. He calls one the broad road and he calls one the narrow road. And he says that we enter each road via a gate. Wide is the gate, he says, that leads to the broad road, and small is the gate that leads to the narrow road. So it's lovely, isn't it? It's very clear imagery. I've said before, during lockdown, we've suddenly discovered so much of the countryside around Redbourne. And so many different walks, beautiful sights. And occasionally you'll come across what Jesus is talking about here. Sometimes there's one of those big, long, wide gates, and it often has a sort of a metal contraption on the end that you pull and then open it and then shut it. And because it's wide, often you're walking onto a sort of fairly broad path. You may have people come in the other way, and even as we're all social distancing, it's fine. There's plenty of space, and people are spread out and all that. And then occasionally you'll be on a much more narrow track. You'll come to one of those, they call it a kissing gate, one of those really small ones that you sort of got to shimmy halfway and look for a random stranger to kiss before you're free to continue. And often there is a narrow path that leads from these things. I remember one particular walk. We walked, I think, towards the mill, Redbourne Mill, and underestimated just how much rain we'd had. And the path was narrow anyway, but it was so boggy and so puddly, and often in places you could just about get round. And then I remember one occasion just looking, thinking, there is no way we are going to get up to our knees here. It's the only way on this sort of narrow path. So we're aware of the images, and Jesus is brilliant at that, just using language pictures that we can all imagine. A wide gate leading to a broad road and a small gate leading to a narrow road. And even before we get any further, and this is what I mean by the warning before the programme, even at this point, in 21st century Britain, our culture, our society, there can be a real reaction of actual horror about what Jesus is saying here. How arrogant is he, people would say, to say there are only two roads in life. This road or that road. We live, don't we, absolutely in a time of so many different beliefs and convictions and values, so many different paths, so many different views about life and how it should be led, so many different views about God and religion, life and eternity. How can Jesus possibly be so closed-minded to say there are only two paths? And of course, we live in terms of an extra layer, don't we, with the conviction that, of course, today every view is of equal validity, every view is of equal worth. And for who is this Jesus, as it were, to challenge the wisdom of our particular age and say there are only two roads in life? And every one of us, according to Jesus, is on this road or this road. Can you imagine the Twitter storm, the social media outrage for Jesus to make the sort of comments and things he's saying here? And he's only going to make a few more as we move on. He says there are only two destinations. Each road leads, says Jesus, to a real destination, a wide gate that leads to a broad road that leads, says Jesus, to destruction, and a small gate that leads to a narrow road that leads to life. In other words, again, Jesus is saying very clearly here that every road, both of these roads, lead somewhere real to a destination. And that's why I think, certainly in terms of the destruction and life being those destinations, Jesus urges at the beginning of what he says in verse 13, he urges his listeners to enter through the narrow gate. Enter through the narrow gate. Now, I just want to say something about these destinations. The word destruction here does not mean annihilation. It doesn't mean that you simply cease to be. The word that he uses, we would have seen on our TV screens recently with the Israel and Gaza sort of conflict and missiles flying, and the camera crew go, don't they? And they see what were once tall, proud, strong buildings lying now as a heap of rubble. And people might talk in these war zones of a town being destroyed. And they're using that word there, destroyed. It doesn't mean that the town no longer exists. It means it's a ruin, it's a wasteland. And that's actually the meaning of the word that Jesus uses here for destruction. It means a place of ruin, a place of waste. And we know that partly because in Matthew 26, and many of you that know some of these Bible stories will know this, in Matthew 26 there's a lady that comes in to see Jesus and his disciples carrying an alabaster jar full of really expensive perfume. And she breaks the jar open in front of everybody and pours the perfume all over Jesus' feet. And the reaction of the disciples is, why this waste? Matthew 26, verse 8, why this waste? And it's the same word that Jesus uses here as he speaks of the broad road leading to destruction. The same word. Why this waste? It could have been sold. The money could have given to the poor. What a waste. That's the sense of the word. Jesus, of course, actually, although, again, some of us don't like to think about it, but Jesus spoke more about hell, more words about hell than he spoke about heaven. And he speaks of hell here with this word destruction, a place of ruin, a place of waste. Why this waste? Just on from this, a passage that we'll come to in a couple of weeks' time, verses 21 to 23 in Matthew 7, Jesus moves us to a slightly different scenario where he says in verse 21, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Many will say to me on that day of judgment, 'Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name drive out demons, in your name perform many miracles?' Then I will tell them plainly," says Jesus, "I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers, away from me." So again, just building the picture of this word destruction. It's a place of waste, and it's a place of expulsion, if you like, from the presence of Jesus, from the presence of God. Separation from him, exclusion from him. Nothing of God and his good gifts will be there. And the picture grows. I did warn you at the beginning. The picture grows in Matthew 8, verse 12. Jesus says that there'll be a sense of people weeping and a gnashing of teeth. It's an expression that speaks of anguish and remorse, regret, that people have ended in this place of utter waste, of ruin, remorse and anguish. And then just to finalise the picture, in Matthew 25, as Jesus speaks about God judging and separating sheep from goats, the very last verse there talks about the everlasting nature of this destruction, that some will go away to everlasting destruction and others to everlasting life. Two destinations. Now, this whole thing, I think, for many of us is a very difficult subject, and in many ways it should be. The prospect is horrifying when you look at what Jesus says and what he talks about. And I think many of us as Christians actually do have a real struggle, I think, don't we, with squaring the God that we know, the God that's been so merciful to us, the God that has forgiven us and washed us clean and sent his Son to rescue us and showered us with grace and mercy and forgiveness and kindness. And we know that Lord personally, and we find when we begin to look at these things and listen to these words, that sort of holding those things together, very difficult, very challenging. And I think one of the reasons why that's so challenging, when you think about it, and I'll give you this to ponder on, is that we now have no concept really of the holiness of God. Very difficult for us to sort of get our heads around what it is to be without sin, completely without sin. To have not sort of one thing that's sort of wrong or unrighteous in us. You know, we struggle to imagine what is it to be totally pure, totally holy, spotless, righteous. But what's it like when you're like that, to view wrongdoing and sin through completely pure, unblemished eyes, to see the very nature of every act, of every heart of a person? And then couple with that with the fact that in God's holiness and his justice, he cannot leave wrong unpunished. It would, in terms of his character, it would be an utter defilement of who he is, a contradiction of who he is, to see wrongdoing and say, doesn't matter, or I'll turn a blind eye. He can't do that and remain who he is, holy, righteous, pure. We have no sort of insight, real insight in what that would be like to be him, to be holy, to be righteous, to be just. We have no idea, do we, in a way, at the moment, God keeps us from it, of the depth of our rebellion. You know, what does it mean for us to say to God, you know, we refuse to serve you as God. We will not love you with all of our heart, mind, soul and strength. We have other things we want to love, other things we want to serve. What does it mean to not love others as ourselves and to mistreat others? And in the many ways that we do, some huge, some small, you know, but we have no real idea of the depth of our rebellion before God and our predicament in front of a God who is holy and righteous and pure. So I think that's one big reason why we struggle with the whole idea of God judging and of this destination called destruction and of waste and of punishment and righteousness. The funny thing is, when we do begin to see that, we then see that the fact that there is another destination in verses 13 and 14, that's the real shock. The fact that there is another destination called life for human beings like us, that's where the shock is. We're so busy being shocked and stunned and bemused and by the fact that there's a destination called destruction or judgment or accountability. But the fact that there's a place called life, that's the shock of these verses. I love, and I've probably said this before, I've been here too long now, I've said everything before. If you've been paying attention, you would remember it all. But I love Les Miserables. Love it. Love it. Seen it several times at the theatre. Been very fortunate to go along. Seen the film, the recent-ish one, and I just love the moment. And my heart sort of just crumples every time it happens. You know exactly what's going to happen because I've seen it before, but it still impacts me. Jean Valjean, convicted criminal, 19 years in prison, out on parole. No one will give him a job. No one will give him a piece of bread. Nobody will give him a place to sleep. And someone directs him to the door of the bishop. And so he knocks on the door. And the bishop says, come in. And he says, oh, no, I almost can't believe it himself. I'm on parole. I've got my yellow paper or whatever it is. He says, no, come in, you're my friend. Takes him in, sits him by the fire, puts a rug around him, puts a meal in front of him, gives him a bed for the night. My home is your home. Lavishes good things, kind things upon him, despite his history and background. He's up in the night, he's helping himself, filling his sack with the silverware. I don't know if this happens on the theatre, I can't remember, but in the film, when the bishop finds him, he actually hits the bishop and floors him and runs. And the next day, the police bring him back to the bishop, caught red-handed, sack of swag on his back, we caught this man. He says, you gave him the silverware. And it's that moment, when the bishop says, I did give him the silverware, but why did you leave the candlesticks? And it's the look on Jean Valjean's face of utter disbelief that the bishop could treat him with such grace, such mercy. You see, it's when God really and truly gives us a clear review of our rebellion that we then look at verses 13 and 14 and think, how can there be a destination called life? And the word that Jesus uses for life here is the word that Jesus uses when he describes the life that is in God himself. It's life in the absolute sense. I think Annika may have prayed about this. It's eternal life, but it's not only the length of life, but the quality of life. Life as God knows it, Jesus says, can be the destination here for us. There is a gate, says Jesus. There is a road or a way that leads to receiving life as God has it. Eternal life in paradise with God forever, where there is no evil, where there is no wrong, where there is no rebellion, there's nothing but love. That it's absolutely as we were created to be. On that day, we will see life in the way that God sees it. This reminds me, actually, the Sermon on the Mount reminds me of the end of the book of Deuteronomy, where God has rescued the people from slavery and everything that came with that, and he's brought them out. He's about to take them into the promised land, and Moses stands up in front of the people and he reminds them of the law of God, the teachings of God, for how best to live life. And he ends with this great sort of rallying cry in Deuteronomy 30. Life and prosperity he puts before the people, or death and destruction. Choose life, says Moses. Choose life. And there's that sense here. Verse 13 really is the beginning of the conclusion of the Sermon on the Mount. It's as if Jesus is standing there like Moses, having taught the Sermon on the Mount, taught and expanded on all that life could be and should be as God has designed it. And he stands there on verse 13 and says to his listeners, then and now this morning, choose life. Choose life. Enter through the narrow gate. It is easy when you think of what Jesus says about the future and judgment and that sort of thing to sort of almost begin to pigeonhole Jesus as some sort of mean character, sort of characterize him in that way. How could he say such things? It's a little bit like the sort of warning signs on the beach, sharks don't swim. What the person that's put that there actually are there for you. They're not against you. And Jesus stands here in verse 13 saying to you and I this morning, choose life. Enter through the narrow gate. The choice seems obvious, doesn't it? Who would, when we actually look at it in terms of what Jesus is saying, who would choose destruction? Why would you? Why would you choose separation and exclusion? Why would you choose anguish and remorse, weeping and gnashing of teeth, rather than life? And yet Jesus does say, doesn't he? He's very realistic about his assessment. Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate, broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. Jesus says there are few on the road to life, but many heading towards destruction. It's such a sad thing. It's the majority choice. It's the majority choice in Redbourne. It's the majority choice in the UK, in every nation of the world. The many find the broad road. Just think a little bit about life today. This road is broad. There's plenty of room. All are welcome. Whatever your beliefs, actually, whatever your convictions, whatever your preferred lifestyle, the broad road is open to all. It's so warm and embracing. Come and join us. And there is a huge variety, actually, although there's only one road. Let's go reverse back to the beginning. There is huge variety on that road. And the one sort of common thing on that road is a refusal to acknowledge Jesus Christ as King. It's a refusal to trust in him for rescue. It's a refusal to bow the knee to him as king. Huge variety, great different expressions of that. But that's the central thing at the bottom of it all. It's a refusal of the king that God has sent. I want to just conclude really by taking some words of Jesus actually from a different gospel, in John's gospel. I want to just highlight where this life can be found. Jesus says, enter through the narrow gate. Small is the gate, narrow is the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. Jesus in John chapter 10 said these words. He said, I am the gate. I am the gate. Whoever enters through me will be saved. I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. In John 14, Jesus, having alluded to this narrow way, Jesus says, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. So the one who's teaching these words in verses 13 and 14, he is the answer. He's the gate. He's the way. He's the one you go to enter onto that narrow way and to find the life that God has to offer. Some other words which have become really prominent for me in this last year. Jesus, on another occasion, I think this is in Matthew, said, come to me, all you who are weary, and I will give you rest. Come to me, all you who are weary. There is a real weariness actually about living on the broad road. I think one of the amazing things about the broad road is that it promises so much. It promises to satisfy you. It promises you contentment. It promises you that you'll discover yourself, that you'll live your best life. Actually, my experience is that a lot of people on the broad road are just weary. It doesn't deliver what it promises. There's a disappointment, a disillusionness, whatever the word is, Jesus said, come to me, all you who are weary, and I will give you rest. It's an Old Testament word, rest, for the promised land. He'll take you into the place that God has promised you. Life, heaven, eternity. Come to me, all you who are weary, and I will give you rest. I will give you that land. I will give you that hope, that life, the life that's in God. So he's the place to come. It goes right back to the beginning of the Beatitudes, doesn't it? Blessed are the poor in spirit. Are you this morning perhaps willing to actually say to God, I am spiritually poor. I'm bankrupt in your sight. I can see now how I've lived. And there's a sense of sorrow and mourning over that sin and that life that's not been led in praise and worship of the God that has given you life. And will you seek him for this free gift of righteousness, seeing that Jesus died for you on the cross? Enter through the narrow gate, says Jesus to you this morning. You may well have kept him at arm's length for many years. And it's that Jean Valjean grace and mercy that says to you, that's okay. Now is the time. Come now. Put your trust in me. Put your hand in mine and enter into life. And just as a final thought for Christians that are feeling weary, the narrow way is a tough way. Again, Jesus says much about this. If you choose to follow Jesus, you're choosing to walk a path that's not the popular path. You may have experienced that, maybe at school, maybe in the workplace, even in your family. It's what are you doing? Why are you listening to Jesus? Why are you following him? Why are his views your views? It's the narrow way. Few find it. It's not popular. It will be difficult. There'll be puddles, there'll be mud. You might not see a way at times. The thing is, Jesus walked that way. Jesus walked the way of suffering and rejection and opposition and threats and insults and beatings and lashings and crucifixion. That's the narrow way Jesus walked to a glorious resurrection and a glorious inheritance that he will share with all who follow him on that narrow way. So it will be tough. It may be tough. You may be quite tempted to throw in the towel. You may be looking from the narrow. I don't know, I didn't do this, but it would fit lovely as an illustration. If me and Karen are up to our knees in mud and over there we can see people on the firmer broad road throwing a ball and having fun, there'll be temptation to run. Let's let Jesus have the last word this morning. Enter through the narrow gate. For wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. Enter through the narrow gate. Well, let's just take a minute just to speak with God ourselves, just quietly reflect on what he said to us, and then Michael lead us through.